Well, a very good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased that we're joined in this BA community webinar by Filip Hendrickx. I first met Filip a few years ago at the BA Conference Europe, and I was really fascinated by his approach to innovation, experimentation, and I've since met with him and discussed the innovation canvas that he has developed and used. And today, Filip is going to be talking about those topics in a presentation entitled Winning in the Innovation Game, Tools, Tactics, and Teams. A little bit about Filip before we start. After about 10 years in business consulting and a prior 10 years in software engineering and research, Filip founded AlterShape to help established organizations become corporate startups. To do this, he follows a structured yet pragmatic approach by bridging business analysis with lean startup and innovation techniques. Filip is also creator of Vantaggio, a benefit mapping tool, and co-founder of Engage, a company focusing on the people side of business agility. And together with Ian Richards, is co-author of the upcoming book on business transformation, When Change Isn't Strange. As if that wasn't enough, he's also Vice President of Events at the IIBA Brussels chapter. And indeed, he recently was heavily involved and chaired and helped to run and organise the fantastic BA and Beyond conference over in Belgium. So a real advocate of business analysis and innovation. So with a presentation entitled Winning in the Innovation Game, Tools, Tactics, Teams, Filip, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and also very welcome to everyone joining in on this webinar. Let me dive in with a small story first to set the scene. I was flying back from a workshop in Brazil recently, and it happened to be my birthday. And as I was on the plane and the flight attendants were walking across with drinks and food, I was wondering, wouldn't it be nice, given the fact that I spent most of my birthday high up in the air, wouldn't it be nice if they offered me a free glass of champagne? Because ultimately, they know that it's my birthday. I have to give it as my passport information when I check in. Even better, they might even give me a free upgrade to business class. Unfortunately, none of that happened. When I touched the ground again and I turned on my cell phone, I got a message, a text message from my energy provider saying, "Dear Filip, have a happy birthday full of energy." And I thought, if my energy provider can do this, then why can't my airline? And I felt it is a good example of how customer expectations don't just change within your domain, within your region of competitors as an organization, but they change overall. It's not just that because airline B does something, that airline A has to compete with that. It's because an energy provider does something that an airline has to compete with that as well. Any organization is raising the bar and making the customer expectations ever higher. So it makes a very challenging environment where innovation quickly becomes mandatory to do. On top of that, what I see happening is that as the expectations rise, and as people, as organizations are starting to apply agile methods more and more, that given the fact that agile methods create some more transparency, that there is also an increased expectation of delivering results quickly, of more predictable results quickly, which is of course very difficult because ultimately you can see what others do and you can measure to a certain extent what customers likes or dislike. But still, it's becoming very difficult because these things change quickly. So there is, on one hand, the expectation for project management, from project management to projects to deliver more quickly and in a more predictable manner. But on the other hand, it's difficult to fulfill that expectation. A third evolution that I see is, and I'll give an example about that. This is the wine guide of a consumer organization in Portugal, where I did a project. And it's a consumer organization a bit similar to Switch in UK. And at some point in time, they had the idea of, instead of having just a paper wine guide, making a digital application for it. Now, The question is this a good idea, this digital application? And immediately, a question popped up from one of the key stakeholders in the project, which is, if we want to do this in a digital application, people will expect many more wines to be in there than in the paper wine guide. The consequence is that we will need to be testing many more wines, and we're not going to be able to do that. It'll cost too much, it'll take too much time, we don't have the resources. And you could question the fact, do we really need to test all these wines? But the answer quickly becomes, this is just the way we work here. And that's a third tension that I see, especially in existing organizations, that is changing the way people work or moving away or innovating without thinking too much upfront about the current way of working is often challenging. So there's a combination of three things that are happening, where as a BA in a project, you have to take into account the customer expectations that are getting higher and higher every day, project execution where there is a request for predictability, and the existing way of working that often hampers your innovation. And sometimes, as I take up the role of BA as well in projects, it kind of makes me feel like this, a really, really tough challenge. Fortunately, people still have dreams, people still have ideas, which is where it usually starts when you are innovating, new ideas that pop up. But there's another challenge with new ideas. Ultimately, the ideas are worthless. Why is that? Well, as Michael Dell puts it, ideas are a commodity. It's the execution that is actually going to bring you value. The problem or the challenge with execution is that it's taking time and resources. It costs money. So you have a bit of a tension here between, on the one hand, you need to have these new ideas, you need to develop these new ideas into successful products, but given the fact that that there is risk involved and that it costs a lot of money to do so, how are you actually going to deal with that? And that's the question that I'm going to try to tackle and give you some examples during this webinar. About these ideas, maybe first a quick check, and Adrian will be putting up the survey question right away. I'm pretty sure that many of you have ideas, but would you invest £50,000 of your own money in your idea? Yes or no?
Fantastic. So those of you that are live on the webinar will have the pop-up now. I can see a number of you are voting. So we have the votes coming in. So in fact, oh yeah, no, we've got a plethora of votes coming in. So we'll leave the voting open for just about another 5 seconds. So get your vote in now, whether you would invest 50,000 in your idea. Okay, I will end the polling now, and I will share the results. So hopefully, Philip, you can see those results.
Yeah, I have them here. Okay, it's on a different screen. So the statistics are 13% yeses and 88% no's. So roughly 90% of the participants would not invest in their own ID, which is actually something that I could have results, whether I do it for 10, 50, or 250 people, it's always a very little number of people that are willing to invest their own money. And the reason is very simple. There is a big risk involved. How to tackle that risk? Well, as I said in the title, tools, tactics, and teams. The approach that I have developed based upon existing approaches that are around, obviously, is what I call think, shape, try. In the think phase, we're going to try to help people move from thinking about their idea to actually action, to put their idea on paper and get a first view on, okay, what is this idea really about? What is going to make this a success? In the shape phase, we're going to get some information, some feedback from customers. We're going to validate the idea qualitatively, And in the try phase, we're going to then verify the results quantitatively with a larger number of people. So the first step is the think phase. And a challenge that I noticed in organizations is that you have two types of people. Some of them want to just take the idea, the first solution that comes to mind, like creating an application on a smartphone where there's digital information of the wines and a way to scan a label and pop up that information. They want to just jump to their computer and start coding. And the other type of people are people that say, no, I have concerns. I think this might be the better feature, or I'm not sure that it will be successful, or it will be too costly, or it will be too difficult to implement, or are we sure that we are achieving the best result for a specific target audience? Lots of questions, all relevant, but ultimately leading to analysis paralysis. So that's why I have created the innovation canvas, which is built or based upon existing canvases like the business model canvas, the lean canvas, the value proposition canvas that you may know. But I have created my own because I wanted to combine two things. On one side, I wanted to have, as you see in the top half, a large, strong focus on the customer side, the outside world, problem customer segment, and so on. On the other hand, I felt it was important in order to keep all stakeholders on board to provide some room for concerns that come from an existing organization, which are on the bottom half. And so if we apply it to the example of the wine app, you see the app on the top right here, we can go through the canvas. I'm not going to go into detail about everything. This is something that you can always have a look at later on. But for example, a problem that we solve with this wine app could be, I have no easy access to wine information and reviews on the go, or it's difficult to find professional yet understandable wine reviews all in one place. The reason we start with the problem is that often people think in terms of solutions. That's probably no news for you, but ultimately, the customer doesn't care about the solution, but about the problem, and he hopes that you can solve that problem in an intuitive, easy way. So if you have the problem, we can find out about the problem context. Where does this problem occur? For example, it could occur while someone is shopping for food and drinks for dinner with friends, or while dining at a restaurant. We can think about the customer segment, wine lovers, but no experts, people that regularly visit restaurants. We can think about the customer value. I'm sure to get a quality wine for the money I pay. I know about alternative wines if some wine is not available anymore, for example. And an interesting one, I won't make a fool of myself when offering wine to friends. This is something that we didn't think of ourselves, but it came up in user research. The point here is that this gives you extra information about the context where your solution might fit, where your solution might create value for the customer. And ultimately, that's what you need in order to bring something, something that is also valuable for your organization. What's also important before diving into the solution is to have a look at existing alternatives. For example, here we have other wine apps, which contain mostly only consumer reviews. That's a point where we might be able to make a difference. But we also have Google and a knowledgeable friend. And so the existing alternatives should force you not only to look at your direct competitors, but also at your indirect competitors, because ultimately they are also a way for the customer to solve his problem. And they might be offering something completely different. For example, a Google search is free, and whereas your direct competitor might not be free or might have advertising, for example. And so the question then becomes quickly, is it actually a good idea to focus on these direct competitors, or can we get inspired by these existing alternatives, the alternative competitors, that somehow provide something useful for a low price or low effort that we might improve upon? And only then the solution becomes more relevant, where the key challenge will be to find those features that are really key differentiators. Obviously, you can discuss a lot and a long time on these topics. The point of having a canvas like this is to focus the discussion on a few different viewpoints, really the customer viewpoint that you want to draw in. And also, it's small, there's not a lot of room to type a lot of stuff, so it really should help you focus on things so that you can go through a first iteration quickly in a workshop of, say, 2 or 3 hours. Moving on to how we are actually going to build the application. We can look at possible partners, because having partners gives you typically an advantage in speed in development, but it can also inspire you on the problem and on the solution. We can have a look at why we should be doing this and not someone else. How does it fit with our values? How does it fit with our mission and our strategy? This is an important box I found out, because people quickly asked me that question, people in an existing organization. If you have a startup, it's more like a greenfield situation where you can do whatever you want. But in an existing organization, people will quickly start worrying, start having relevant concerns about how does this fit in? Why should we be doing this? This is our role that we have to play. So we need some place in the canvas, in my experience, to put that concern in order to keep those people engaged. You show that you listen to them and that you care about the input they give. Because if it's the wine expert is giving you this information and you would ignore it, well, you're going to need the wine expert further down the road when you're actually implementing the solution. Another example of this are the key enablers and competences. The example I gave earlier about the fact that we might have to do lots of tests and they might cost a lot of time and a lot of money, it's a valid concern at this point in time. So listen to it, note it down, and we'll see later on how important it is once we are starting to validate the ID. The same thing goes for what's in it for us. How are we going to capture some value? Are we going to create an increase in loyalty? Is it going to be an app with advertisement, some other way where we have a partnership or the partner pays in some way, subsidized, lots of possibilities, and always a good idea to note these down. But as I said before, it's about a workshop of 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe do 2 iterations to get focus and to get people from talking to acting. What is the key things that we want to deal with when we think about this application, when we think about this ID? What is the problem you're going to solve? And the concerns that pop up as you discuss it are noted down. Now, this is all fine, but it's also not good. It's not good in the sense that what we have written down is theory. It's what we think, what we believe, and often we think our ideas are good ideas, but if we look at the market results, then it's not the case. You see here, of all startups that fail, the top reason for failure is no market need. So these are startups that have spent time and money, spent resources in building something where ultimately there was no market for. Whatever the statistics you look at, it's always around the same number, around 50% of startups fail because they solve a problem that doesn't exist. Whether it's B2B, B2C, the numbers are always very similar. So this kind of proves that even though your tools for getting the idea on paper and moving people to action, having different ways of looking at the problem, even if those tools are relevant, whatever you write down, it's an assumption. So the question, as Hendrickx has put it in his book, famous quote, the big question of our time is not can it be built, but should it be built? And that's where the shape phase comes in. We're going to start validation. And then I have a second question for you. How soon do you check with customers? So once you have an ID, does it take you a week, a month, 3 months, 6 months, or longer to do the first check of that ID with your customers?
Okay, so the poll is now open. So those of you that are live on the webinar, please do enter your thoughts onto the webinar poll. I can see people are starting to vote. So we'll just leave this open for about another 10 seconds. So if you are live, just hit the option which is most relevant for you, and we'll just leave it open for a couple more seconds so we can get a few more votes as I see people are continuing to vote. So 3, 2, 1, and I will end the polling, and I am now sharing the results. So you should be able to see the results now, Filip.
Yeah. So here there is quite a bit of diversity, which is good. Most of the time when I do this survey, most people wait quite a long time, but still there is only one person who is doing the first customer check within 1 week. And actually, that number should be 100%. Because what have we written down on the canvas is just what we think. And the reality is that the customer might agree or might disagree. And the sooner we check that, the more chance is that we are actually going towards something successful. The quicker we will find out if we are thinking about something that is really not relevant for the customer. So you cannot check too early. A challenge that I see in a lot of organizations is that it's very difficult for people to actually do that check quickly. People think, no, I need some time to think about the idea, to develop it a bit further, to analyze it, to see, do some market research and so on. And I think that's all understandable. But I also think that you miss a chance, you miss an opportunity of getting early feedback. If I just would go outside and ask some random people, how do you go about choosing a wine when you're out for dinner? I would get relevant feedback. And I don't need anything up front in order to ask that question. So on the first day where you have the ID, that validation process could start and should start. To make it a little bit more easy, the canvas provides an overlay of different questions, turning your statements on the canvas into assumptions. Is the problem really relevant for the customer? Think about the statistics we saw. Is the problem or the solution rather valuable and accessible for the customer? Does it bring him value in his mind? Does he agree with that? Does he have, for example, a smartphone if we are developing a smartphone solution for our customer segment? We can check that. Should we do it according to the customer? For example, the consumer organization was thinking about adding to its website for selecting car insurances. It was thinking about adding a pay button where you could immediately pay for the car insurance and buy that car insurance right away on the website of the neutral consumer organization. And it was a good idea in the sense that it would make the process less cumbersome, just a one-click process for the customer. But the customer thought it was a bad idea because the perception of neutrality would be impacted. So we always need to do that check with the customer and not only with your own strategy. Is it viable? Obviously, does the customer want to invest his time, his money? And can we provide what's essential for the customer? Coming back again to the example of the wine testing process, if the customer says, yes, I want 1,000 wines in this app, and we can validate that through some research, then okay, it makes sense to put up a process where we can actually perform those 1,000 tests. But if the customer says no, if I have like 2 or 3 wines that are good in each store, then we don't need that many tests. Then we can do with maybe 50 or 100 tests. So depending on what the customer is expecting, we're going to actually set up the right process instead of depending on what we think is important for the customer. So it's basically a simple overlay that turns everything, every statement we put on the canvas into an assumption to help people think about the customer point of view and to help people trigger the validation mindset in people's minds. An example, there are many, many techniques, but obviously if we start validating early on, the customer interview is a very good technique to do some first qualitative validation. Some things that I want to highlight here, it's not so much about us talking, it's mostly about us listening to the customer. Have the customer tell his story. How do you go about selecting a wine in this or that context? And learn from the customer, learn from how he does it, learn from what works and what doesn't work well. Get to know these alternative solutions. And for example, what you can learn here also is that if the customer says, yes, this is an important problem, I think it would be good if we'd have a solution for that. I think it would be good if you build that app. And if you ask him then, what do you use now to solve that problem? And he says, well, actually, I don't use anything. I don't solve the problem. Then maybe the problem isn't that important after all. A third point that I'd like to highlight here is the validation. You have to try to find ways to validate the intent of actually using your product or service right from the start. And a way of validating at this early stage where you don't have anything yet apart from an ID could be the question for follow-up. If the customer is interested, he will be okay with you coming back to him after a few weeks or months of time and you have developed the ID further. You can also ask for referrals. If the answer to both these questions is negative, then probably even though the feedback during the customer telling his story was good, probably the customer isn't really that interested. So if most customers don't give you permission to follow up and don't give you any referrals, then maybe the idea isn't worth pursuing after all. So that's the shape phase. And obviously there are other techniques which we can dive into during the questions or during the full day workshops that I give. I also give more examples. But it's about understanding the problem and understanding the key success factors of the solution. It's about shaping the problem and the problem context and shaping the solution. The next step is in the try phase, where we're going to try to verify whatever we have shaped, designed in the shape phase. And this is more or less a bit of the same, but it's more about detailed features. We're actually going to start building something that looks like a product, that looks like a service. An example of this is the pay-per-view system, or the pay-per-view approach, where for one of the consumer organizations that I've worked for, next to the monthly payment that you see on the right side, where you have 7.5 euros per month for a subscription that gives you full access to the complete website on top of the paper magazine, they started to experiment with a payment for accessing one single article online, which would cost 3 euros once. And the shape phase was done mainly based on existing information from a similar service that already existed for a few years in Germany. This experiment was done in Spain. And so they looked at the numbers from Germany. They looked promising. They did a similar test in Spain. And what they learned from that test during that shape phase was that there was interest, but the interest was much lower than in Germany. So that helped them fine-tune the business case. It helped them fine-tune the investment that they would be willing to make for this, developing this service. And then in the try phase, they actually started to implement the feature of payments. But instead of fully implementing it right from the start, they first put up a second test. So if people click on the button, continue on the left side, the first test would give them for free access to the article with a mention of, we're just doing some tests, we're learning from this, you get access for free for now. And it was a small test that showed that the business case for Spain was actually very different from the business case for Germany. In a second step, they added a second screen behind this one, where users could choose different payment options: PayPal, credit card, their own bank card. And what they saw was that at that point, 90% of the people that had clicked on the first button, continue, that showed a clear intent to buy, 90% of these dropped out. So it's proved that even though a first validation may be positive, it's still important to, down the road, as you are developing your application, as you are developing all the features, that you still need to continue validation. That you need to verify whatever you have validated at an early stage, at a larger scale, for a larger number of users. And so that brings me to what I call the MVP challenge. The MVP, the minimum viable product, actually has a conflict built in. The conflict between minimum and viable product. In order to have a viable product, something that you can put online, if it's an online service, and that people can use and buy, it needs to have enough body, it needs to have enough features. And that is in contradiction with minimum, obviously, because minimum is as small as possible. And the question is, how do you deal with that? If you define your product, you typically are going to define a certain scope that you want to implement. And the question then becomes, in this MVP challenge, are you defining at the start of your project, are you defining scope, or are you defining validations? So scope meaning we are going to list the features that we think we need in order to make this product or service a success. And defining validations is just defining a number of tests, a number of assumptions, and checking how you can validate those assumptions. So there's a third question. How are you defining currently your MVPs?
Okay, so the poll is now launched. So those of you that are live on the webinar, please do go ahead and vote. I can see the votes are starting to come in now. So we'll just wait about 10 seconds or so for the votes to arrive. So just a few seconds to get any final votes in. So 3, 2, 1, and I will end polling there and share the results. So you should be able to see the results now, Philip.
This is actually quite good, 50-50. That means that half of the participants here in this audience are defining their MVPs through scope, and half of them are defining their MVPs through validations. But if we would do it through scope, then what we do is actually build something. If we do it through validations, we get a different dynamic. And that is what I call the MVP being a byproduct of the validation process. And this is really key in innovation. Instead of thinking about features that you write down and that you implement, you think about, okay, what is the next biggest risky assumption and how are we going to validate that with a minimal effort? And you're not thinking about building an actual product, you're just thinking about building a minimal test, to validate that assumption. And if you do that well, you can learn whether or not to continue or stop. And as your tests become more close to an actual product, for example, by going from customer interviews, surveys, mock-ups, fake implementations like the pay-per-view implementation with nothing behind it, and then in the end actually building features. If you go through a validation process, you will get closer and closer to something that is actually a real product or a real service. And that is the result of the validation process. Just like, metaphorically speaking, the rainbow is an automatic result of the combination of sun and rain. So if you go through that validation process, you will automatically end up either with a kill because you learn that it's not feasible, because you learn there is no audience that is willing to pay whatever you hope them to pay, or you will end up with something that you can actually launch that is actually a viable product. That's your MVP as a consequence of the validation process. Now, in order to make that work, we need a good process and we need good teams. So instead of thinking about scope and getting the dynamics, the classic project dynamics where people define their scope and then try to convince with the business cases this is the right thing to invest in, we want people to invest, a lot of people to invest in a lot of ideas using small amounts of money so that you can do this first validation and then build a better business case. Like we saw in the example of pay-per-view, where the German business case could not directly be translated to the Spanish market. So instead of working for a small number of ideas, defining a full scope for the MVP, building it, and then often not having a result that satisfies the customer, and as a consequence, not having a result that is bringing business value, what we're actually looking for is a funnel where we can start with a large number of ideas and going through a validation process as teams develop the ideas, teams validate the ideas step by step, ultimately ending up with a small number of successful ideas that satisfy the customer and that can satisfy the business that we are in. And this matches also with the think, shape, try phase as we go through the funnel. Key in this, and that's then the third point of the third aspect of the webinar, key thing in this are the teams. So what we tried to do was set up in this is an example from the consumer organization again, is set up in 5 different countries, 5 groups of ID teams. Anyone who had an ID could start developing. He or she could start gathering a team around the ID and start developing the ID. Originally, we had one central, across the 5 countries, one central innovation portfolio management team that was actually building the IDs they liked, building the IDs they thought had potential. But it created quickly created a bottleneck, and it also disengages people because someone else is taking up their ID, may or may not understand it, decide upon it, do something with it, but it disconnects from the people that are actually having the ID. Here we have moved to ID teams taking ownership of their ID, developing it fully, but on the one hand, they are supported by a validation support team that can help them whenever they need some support in some domain like marketing, customer research, web development, user experience design. But it's pull from the ID team rather than push from the support team. And the innovation portfolio management team is a small team that is looking at the overall list of IDs, trying to see if there are IDs in different groups in different countries that might be inspiring for each other, and having a look whether all these ID teams are following the process. So instead of, as they originally did, selecting IDs based upon the contents of the ID, they are now following up on whether the ID teams are following a good validation process. And this is what I call managed flow, not content. The ID the innovation portfolio management team is checking for each ID whether or not the innovation canvas is filled in correctly to the spirit. Did they really think about the different viewpoints, internal and external viewpoints, or did they just wrote something down quickly that isn't really an in-depth study, an in-depth analysis of the ID? Did they really have those different viewpoints in there? What is the team composition? Do we think we have the right team? And they can say, or they can propose to add a team member because they feel it's an idea that has a lot to do with marketing, for example, existing contents to a new audience. And they might say, okay, your team needs marketing input. So they can evaluate a team composition. Obviously, there is a need to make sure that the idea fits within the strategy. If your strategy is to try to improve your success with existing customers, and someone comes up with an idea to target a new market, then you can say, no, this doesn't fit our strategy. And the fourth parameter that we used in this context was a validation scenario. Did the ID team bring a good validation approach together with their ID? Not just the ID, but what are the key assumptions and how are we going to validate these? So you see here, these are the parameters that were being used in this organization. The point is that we focus from the ID management, overall management, we focus on making sure that people are following the flow, following the process, but we are not arguing on the content because that's just a matter of opinion. And that's a discussion that often disengages people. So to summarize, 3 key aspects: tools that help you broaden your views and that get people from talking to acting on the ID, so that you can move quickly after 1 or 2 short workshops, move quickly to your first validation with the customer. Tactics, a whole process, all the way through the process, you are going to validate whether or not this is potentially successful, and be ready to kill your IDs as you measure negative results. And this is actually something that we saw by giving ID teams ownership of their ID and ownership of the validation process. We saw that people actually accepted the fact that some IDs needed to be killed. They killed their own IDs because they learned themselves from the customer. And finally, as I mentioned, the teams manage flow, not content. Now, what does this mean for BA? Well, in my opinion, it's an opportunity for BA, for people with a BA role, to not just help people with the contents, but help people with facilitating the ownership, facilitating the flow, the process of innovation, and putting the contents in the hands of the people that are actually having the idea and really believers of their idea and trying to make it a success, but giving them some tools, tactics, and some guidance in going through the process of validation, hopefully ending up with the success, but being ready for killing the ideas. So thank you very much. That's overall the 3 points that we have been trying to set up in different organizations. Summarizing: first test, then invest, as a key mantra to follow. If you have any questions or thoughts on this, I'm very happy to answer these or go into more detail on some aspects.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Filip. And I do see a few questions coming in. But just before we take the questions, for those of you who are live on the webinar, please do feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A window, and we'll answer as many as we can during the session. So, Filip, the first question that comes from a few people on the webinar actually is, where can they get a copy of the innovation canvas? Are you able to make a template available, Filip?
Yes, there is actually, and I will quickly go back to the slides. I can share the slides afterwards, but here you can see at the bottom my website where you can download a PDF version of the canvas. I am in the process of updating it, but also on the website you will see any updates that follow. The content will stay the same, but we're giving it a fresher look. Let's see.
Fantastic. So there's the website at the very bottom there to get a copy of the template. So Okay, so our next question is around stakeholders who fall in love with a particular solution. And the question is around advice. What advice would you give someone if they're put on a project and it feels like the decisions have already been made on the solution? Is there still a place to use the innovation canvas, Philip, or is it too late at that point?
I think there is, and sometimes you have to sneak your way into it. But as I said, if you can get validation started, and these stakeholders are actually doing the validation themselves as well, then they will learn directly themselves from the customer. So that often helps to give them a better view on the reality. As I said before, stakeholders noticed that their idea wasn't that good and were actually proposing themselves to kill or change the solution. I think it's important that by using a technique like the canvas, for example, just to make sure that you understand what the idea is about, you help sometimes reframing the idea of the project from solution to problem. So you can help broaden the viewpoint of your stakeholder. By putting on these explicit validations, again, you can help these stakeholders to realize that indeed what they have written down is their idea, but do they have numbers? Do they have some kind of proof to back that up? So those are things that might help, but obviously some people are more stubborn than others, so it's not a silver bullet. A third thing that I might add is that it's impossible to build everything at once. So as you define the implementation roadmap, you can sneak in Europe what are, in your opinion, the most risky assumptions for the project, or for the product or service you're developing, and make sure that you are building something small that is already in some way valuable or should be valuable, and try to define together with the stakeholder a small test for a very small test audience. It could even be an internal test in your organization to get people started on serving the customer. We did a survey in the organization ourselves first, and we learned from that. And that really was an eye-opener for people. So it's a matter of finding these ways in. Sometimes you can use a canvas directly, sometimes you need a few sneaky ways, and I'd love to, if you have a very specific context and you want to bounce off some ideas, feel free to contact me, because I'd love to think about that, as it's also a source of inspiration for me.
That's really interesting. I was smiling and laughing along with you there, Philip, because I think your comment about some stakeholders are more stubborn than others is a very well made observation. But I really liked what you said there about almost letting the process open people's minds, because if we can help them come to the conclusion themselves, if we can help them, if we can work as a team and sort of learn our way through, then it doesn't feel like we're sort of imposing or blocking. It feels like we're enabling, and that has to be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so our next question is, how can you propose a new idea to a business that already has expectations on your team? So that's quite a broad question. How would you address that one, Philip?
Well, it's indeed a broad question, but if we have certain expectations, for example, around the solution, this is what occurs most of the time. By moving or working back from the solution towards the problem and the problem context, that quickly opens up minds, in my experience. Thinking about, okay, we have this wine app that we want to build because the wine guide is already a success, and we believe that with the wine app we're going to reach a larger audience. We're going to reach an audience, people in a restaurant, that cannot take or do not want to take the book with them, that would forget the wine guide, the paper wine guide at home. So by working your way back from the solution to the problem and the problem context to the customer segment, you quickly broaden the viewpoints of people, and I think that helps a lot. Also, the validation process, coming back to the expectations around these key enablers and competences, coming back to the example of the test process for wines, the lab tests. By turning it into a question, what is the customer expecting, and can we somehow measure that? You are again trying to broaden the view of everyone involved, of people in the team and of the people outside the team, the stakeholders outside the team. So there again, I think that it's a matter of using the right questions. And once people are starting to get used to this approach, the first time it's new, the second time they've seen it before. So whether I think that a canvas, it could be this one, it could be a variation depending on your context. But having this approach that you are reusing time and time again will make people get used to it, and it will make it easier for you to be involved and make people understand, make people feel comfortable with broadening their view and moving away from the initial expectations.
Yeah. So actually showing them that the process works, and then it becomes repeatable, so they have that expectation, and it repeats. Fantastic. Okay, so our next question is: at what point or indicators, or what point / indicators do we know that an innovative idea will not be successful?
That's a good question. That's a tough one. I think early on in the process, you have to set clear boundaries. If I take back the funnel slides, this one here, what you want here, I do not believe in the ultimate ID. Some companies are able to pull that off, like Apple, and even they make huge mistakes every now and then. Overall, the success in the future is not finding early on one great ID, but is about going through a process where you start off with many IDs and filtering out. So instead of stating this is success for ID X, what you could do is stating, okay, we want to start a funnel with so many IDs each month, and we are just going to filter out and leave like 25% of the IDs. Instead of saying for each ID is this a good one, you make a relative comparison, and the 25% best IDs, you continue to the next step. So that's a way of moving IDs through the funnel. Another indicator that is often used further down the road is for the product market fit, which is, in my opinion, positioned at the end of the funnel here, because at the end of the funnel, then you start really building and marketing the application or the service. Is that if 40% of your customers would feel very disappointed if they would not have access to your product or service anymore, then you have product market fit. So that's also an interesting way of measuring whether or not you want to continue with the IE or not. A third way could be, if I take back the quote of Rita McGrath here, is that you just set a certain amount of money for your initial validations, and you have 2 or 3 validation steps early on, and people can spend a certain amount of money on it, and that's it. And if at that point in time they do not have a convincing business case with numbers from the outside world, then they can't continue with the ID. But I do notice that people, if they do the validation themselves, if they are face-to-face with customers, doing customer interviews, that they will quickly feel whether or not an ID has potential.
Yeah. It's that feedback loop, isn't it, of getting early feedback and frequent feedback, and actual real feedback rather than sort of proxy feedback or insights. So it's interesting, Filip, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about one challenge I imagine would be the sunken cost fallacy, where I'd imagine particularly organizations that aren't used to working in this way will sort of, when like, well, we can't possibly stop that because we've already invested £100,000 in it, or dollars or euros. And something which was just springing to mind as you were speaking there, I think it was Chip and Dan Heath that talked about setting tripwires. They called them tripwires, which is like, if we haven't achieved X by this particular time, then that trips a review of, the idea or whatever, as a sort of counter to that sort of sunken cost fallacy. I don't know what your opinion on setting tripwires would be. I guess it's very similar to some of the ideas you sort of described.
I think it's very useful because it indeed forces people to make a conscious choice, and after a while that becomes a habit. So I absolutely think that's part of the puzzle here. I also think that you really have to limit the initial amount that people get to validate their ID. I see way too many people jump to developing something in order to validation, whereas I think that if you're a creative, you can do reasonably credible validation, reasonably correct validation with a much smaller amount of money.
Yeah.
For example, if we think that building a wine app is good, it means we think that when people are in a restaurant, they are willing to take their mobile phone, type in the wine that they might choose, and get some feedback on how could you test that without building something. But for example, you could launch a WhatsApp number and have people that are in restaurants, give them the chance to give some information on that WhatsApp number, and there is someone physically, the wine expert, waiting and giving them feedback on that wine. The implementation cost of this validation is very, very, very low, but it will give you very relevant feedback on how many people actually would use this kind of service. So I think that preventing the sunk cost fallacy is also done by reducing the initial funding that you give to the validation process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You reduce the sunk cost fallacy by sinking less cost, which is great. It's great. Okay, fantastic. So a fairly, again, open question here, Filip. So I'm not sure how you'd interpret this one, but the question is how does this relate to agile software development methodologies? I'm guessing the person is probably referring to approaches like Scrum or Kanban or DSDM. Do you see this sort of approach as fitting well with those sorts of, and not just agile software, of course, it could be agile product development or any kind of, do you see the two fitting well together?
Yes, absolutely. Two things that come to mind is agile is about iterations and iterative feedback. The iteration gives you the ability to have direct feedback because you build a working partial product in every iteration. So the smaller you can make these iterations, the higher the frequency of validations. So that definitely fits with the agile mindset. Another thing that comes to mind is the importance of having an engaged team that can make decisions and that has ownership on the idea instead of some external department in the big organization that makes the decisions. Ultimately, you have the team that makes the decisions, given a certain amount of money where they can use to do the validation. And that's also something that is really key in the agile mindset. So I see the agile principles as a very strong help in getting this way of working, getting this lean startup way of working, way of doing product development. It's a really strong support, in my opinion. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's, as you say, the sort of underpinning principles are very, very consistent. There's a nice sort of overlap there, isn't there? So good. Okay, so next question is around business cases. How would this approach relate to a traditional business case? So I'm guessing the person there is probably working in an environment where there are very formal business cases produced with, I don't know, with internal rate of return and net present value and accounting ratios. Does this approach, is that compatible with those type of business cases, or does it happen before, or how would you position it?
That's a very good question, and it's actually a question that we also had in the consumer organization that I've been working with, where I made the first steps of developing the approach and the canvas. If I go back to the funnel here, what we did was we put the business case stage after Think, Shape, Try. So in the Think, Shape, Try process, with a limited amount of money, people had to gather numbers from the outside world to build their business case. So instead of building the business case up front, defining an MVP scope, defining features, defining the costs that it might take for these features, and having a very rough or maybe even random estimation of potential return, we do it after the Think, Shape, Try phase. Because then we can base our business case on real numbers. And if I come back to the example of pay-per-view, because we did those tests, we knew that the numbers from the original business case, if we would have made it all the way up front on the left of this slide, we knew that this business case was completely wrong. It would have been based on the German market, and it made a lot of sense before starting the process of going through the funnel. But by doing a small number of tests, we learned that the numbers for the Spanish market are very different. And then you end up with a business case on the right side of this slide that is actually built upon real facts from the outside world. It also changes the mindset of building a business case where you try to calculate the price of your product or service based on the cost of what you need to implement, but you turn it into a viewpoint where you learn from the market what the market is willing to pay for your service or product, and that gives you information on how much you should be spending or could be spending on the development of the idea. So that change in mindset is something that you can trigger by moving the business case moment towards the right side in the funnel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this becomes pre-project. This becomes about the concept, which will later become a business case or a project if it's successful. So almost like some organizations refer to seed funding. It's almost like a seed funding for an internal innovative project. So
yes, what is important in that context is that the business case itself still contains a lot of assumptions, less than if you create it all the way on the left, but it still contains assumptions. So you keep on driving the validation process with the numbers in the business case as you go. It shouldn't be a one-shot business case creation moment. It should be something that guides you through developing a product or service with validation all the way through.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we're just about at the end of time. So, Filip, if you could just move to the final slide, that would be fantastic. So, really, the only thing left for us to say on this webinar is a massive thank you. To Filip for presenting. I think it's been a really informative session. I'm sure all of us on the webinar have gained a huge amount for being here, and also thank you to everyone who has dialed in. We will be sending out a short survey just after the session. As a reminder, this is part of a BA community webinar series. So as part of the questionnaire, you'll have the opportunity to type in any other suggestions of topics before you close that survey. So do let us know of any other topics, and we'll try and arrange webinars. So any final thoughts, Filip, just before we close?
Yes, I have put up maybe the one last slide. Part of the approach is to get people moving from talking to acting. And so I would also find it really interesting if people that have followed the webinar think about what will they validate tomorrow. Some people say they validate very quickly, which is great. Some people say they wait a bit longer. So maybe a good question for you to think about after the webinar is, what will you validate tomorrow, and how will you then validate that as quickly and cheaply as possible?
Fantastic. And maybe people can tweet their response to that if they wish, and we can all stay in touch. So so thanks again, Filip, for a really practical, really useful webinar. Thank you to everyone that has tuned in. We do have another webinar planned for next month, and actually, if you are attending live, when you close the webinar, you'll be able to sign up straight away. It's actually about the role of digital in business analysis, and it will be an expert panel. So we have 3 expert speakers who are going to be joining us, and it'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions you have about doing business analysis in the digital environment. So do keep an eye out for the next webinar. Thanks again, Filip, and to everyone attending, have a fantastic evening, morning, afternoon, and hope to see you again soon.